Sarah Martinez had been working as a military intelligence analyst at Naval Base Coronado for 3 years, but she had never encountered anything quite like the mysterious case that arrived on her desk that cold Tuesday morning in November. The metal briefcase, weathered and dented, bore classification markings she had only seen in training manuals. The shipping manifest listed it as personal effects, recovered Operation Neptune's Gate, 1987. Commander Jake Sullivan, the base's most decorated SEAL, had specifically requested that Sarah handle this particular case. His reputation preceded him. 25 years of service, multiple deployments in the most dangerous corners of the world, and a Medal of Honor hanging on his office wall. When a man like Sullivan personally requested your expertise, you didn't ask questions. You simply delivered results. The case had been discovered during the demolition of an old storage facility at a decommissioned naval installation in Virginia. Workers found it buried beneath decades of forgotten paperwork and obsolete equipment, sealed away like a secret that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. The base commander had sent it to Coronado because Sullivan's name appeared on several of the documents attached to the case. Sarah examined the exterior carefully before attempting to open it. The lock mechanism was unlike anything she had seen in modern military equipment. It appeared to be a custom design, with multiple security features that suggested whatever was inside was of extreme importance. She noted the faded stickers and markings that indicated the case had traveled through various military installations over the years. When she finally managed to breach the lock using specialized tools from the cryptography department, the first thing that struck her was the smell. It wasn't the musty odor of age that she expected. Instead, there was a faint chemical scent, almost medicinal, as if the contents had been preserved with some kind of special treatment. The case was lined with foam padding, and nestled within were dozens of photographs, document folders, and what appeared to be personal items. Sarah put on white cotton gloves before handling anything, knowing that proper preservation protocols were essential when dealing with potentially classified historical materials. The photographs were the first items to catch her attention. They showed a group of young Navy SEALs in what appeared to be a jungle environment. The quality was good despite their age, and she could make out faces clearly. One face in particular stood out immediately. A young man with intense dark eyes and a confident smile that she recognized as Commander Sullivan, though he looked barely 25 years old in the image. As she continued examining the photographs, Sarah began to notice troubling details. Some images showed the SEAL team working alongside individuals who were clearly not American military personnel. Their clothing and equipment suggested they might be local militia or perhaps mercenaries. Several photographs showed what appeared to be civilian prisoners, though their faces had been partially obscured by damage to the film. The document folders contained mission briefings, operational reports, and correspondence between various military officials. As Sarah read through the papers, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Operation Neptune's Gate appeared to have been an unofficial mission, operating outside normal military channels and command structure. The documents referenced plausible deniability and off-the-books operations multiple times. One particular folder contained correspondence between Commander Sullivan and a mysterious figure identified only as Control 7. The letters discussed payment schedules, equipment needs, and references to the package that needed to be secured at all costs. The tone of the correspondence was unlike anything Sarah had seen in official military communications. It read more like correspondence between business partners than between military personnel and their command structure. Sarah found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable as she delved deeper into the case's contents. Her training had prepared her to handle classified materials, but this felt different. These documents suggested activities that seemed to operate in a gray area of military law, if not completely outside it. Among the personal items in the case, Sarah discovered a leather journal with entries written in Commander Sullivan's handwriting. The entries detailed daily activities during what appeared to be a several-month deployment in an unnamed jungle location. The early entries were routine, describing training exercises and reconnaissance missions. But as the dates progressed, the tone became increasingly dark and conflicted. One entry, dated 3 months into the deployment, described an incident that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sullivan had written about being ordered to secure intelligence from local contacts through whatever means necessary. The entry described methods that clearly violated military codes of conduct and international law. Sullivan's own words revealed his growing unease with the orders he was receiving. The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing. Sullivan wrote about discovering that the mission's true purpose was not what he and his team had been told. Instead of gathering intelligence on terrorist activities, they were apparently facilitating the movement of what the journal cryptically referred to as high-value cargo through the region. Sullivan's writing became increasingly erratic as he realized his team was being used for purposes they never would have agreed to support. The last entry was dated exactly 1 week before the official end of Operation Neptune's Gate. Sullivan wrote about his intention to document everything and secure evidence of what his team had been forced to participate in. He mentioned hiding copies of photographs and documents in multiple locations, ensuring that the truth would eventually come to light even if something happened to him. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly as she closed the journal. She had been expecting routine historical documents, perhaps some interesting stories about past military operations. Instead, she had stumbled upon evidence of what appeared to be illegal activities conducted under military cover. The implications were staggering, not just for Commander Sullivan's career, but potentially for the entire chain of command that would have been involved in such an operation. She looked at her watch and realized she had been working for over 6 hours without a break. The office was quiet, as most of her colleagues had gone home for the evening. Sarah knew she needed to be extremely careful about how she proceeded. The materials in the case were clearly sensitive, and making the wrong move could have serious consequences for everyone involved. As she prepared to secure the materials for the night, Sarah noticed one more item she had missed during her initial examination. Tucked into a small pocket in the case's lining was a single photograph that had been wrapped in protective plastic. When she unwrapped it, she found herself staring at an image that made her stomach drop. The photograph showed Commander Sullivan standing next to a man in civilian clothing, who Sarah immediately recognized from intelligence briefings. It was Viktor Kozlov, a known arms dealer who had been on military watch lists for decades. The two men were shaking hands in what appeared to be a friendly meeting, and in the background Sarah could see military equipment being loaded onto unmarked trucks. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications of what she had discovered. Tomorrow morning, she would need to brief Commander Sullivan on the contents of the case, as he had requested. But now she wondered if his request had been motivated by a desire to recover potentially incriminating evidence rather than simple curiosity about historical materials. She carefully repacked everything in the case, making detailed notes about the location and condition of each item. Her training demanded thoroughness and accuracy, even when dealing with materials that made her deeply uncomfortable. As she prepared the case for secure storage overnight, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just opened a door that was meant to stay closed forever. The next morning would bring answers. But Sarah suspected that those answers would only lead to more disturbing questions about the man she had been ordered to trust with some of the military's most sensitive intelligence work. Sarah arrived at the office early the next morning, having barely slept the night before. The weight of what she had discovered pressed heavily on her mind, and she found herself questioning every aspect of her findings. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation for the materials in the case. Perhaps the documents had been taken out of context, or the photographs misrepresented the situations they depicted. Commander Sullivan was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock for the briefing, giving Sarah 2 hours to organize her thoughts and prepare her presentation. She had decided to present the facts objectively, without speculation or interpretation, and allow the commander to provide context for anything that seemed concerning. At exactly 9 o'clock, Sullivan knocked on her office door. When Sarah opened it, she was struck by how different he looked from the confident officer she had met briefly during her orientation. His face was drawn and tense, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well either. Perhaps he already suspected what the case might contain. "Ms. Martinez," Sullivan said, extending his hand in greeting. His grip was firm, but Sarah noticed a slight tremor that he quickly tried to conceal. "I appreciate you taking the time to examine those materials personally. I know you must have questions about why I specifically requested your involvement in this matter." Sarah gestured for him to take a seat across from her desk, where she had arranged copies of the most significant documents and photographs from the case. The original case sat locked in the secure storage area, but she had prepared a comprehensive briefing package for their discussion. "Commander, before we begin, I want you to know that I've followed all proper protocols for handling classified materials," Sarah said carefully. "I've prepared a complete inventory of the case contents, and I'm ready to brief you on my findings. However, some of the materials raise questions that are beyond my area of expertise." Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. Well, let's proceed with your briefing, and I'll provide whatever context I can to help clarify any confusion." Sarah opened the first folder and placed a photograph on the desk between them. It was one of the clearer images showing the young Sullivan with his SEAL team in the jungle. The case contained extensive documentation from Operation Neptune's Gate, including mission photographs and personal effects. "Can you confirm your participation in this operation?" For a moment, Sullivan said nothing. He stared at the photograph with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. It seemed to be a mixture of nostalgia, regret, and something that might have been fear. "Operation Neptune's Gate," he said slowly, as if the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in 37 years. Where exactly was this case discovered?" Sarah consulted her notes. "It was found during demolition work at the old Norfolk Auxiliary Naval Facility. According to the shipping manifest, it had been in storage since 1987. Sullivan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, Sarah saw something she had never expected to see in a decorated military officer: genuine fear. "Ms. Martinez, before I say anything else, I need you to understand that some operations from that era were conducted under different rules than we follow today. The Cold War created situations where military personnel were asked to make difficult choices in service of national security." Sarah placed another document on the desk, one of the correspondence files between Sullivan and Control 7. "Commander, these documents suggest that Operation Neptune's Gate was conducted outside normal military command structure. Can you explain the nature of your relationship with Control 7? Sullivan's composure cracked slightly. He picked up the document with hands that were now visibly shaking and read through it quickly. As he did so, his face grew pale. "This shouldn't exist," he whispered. "These documents were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Sullivan's reaction was confirming her worst fears about the materials in the case. She placed the photograph of Sullivan with Victor Kozlov on the desk. "Commander, can you explain this photograph? Our intelligence databases identify this individual as Victor Kozlov, a known arms dealer who has been on military watch lists since the 1980s. When Sullivan saw the photograph, the color drained completely from his face. He seemed to age 10 years in an instant, and when he looked up at Sarah, his eyes held a haunted quality that she had only seen in combat veterans discussing their worst memories. "How many people have seen these materials?" Sullivan asked urgently. "Only myself, sir. The case was delivered directly to me, and I followed all security protocols. But, Commander, I need to understand what I'm looking at here. These documents suggest activities that appear to violate military regulations and possibly federal law. Sullivan stood up abruptly and began pacing behind his chair. Ms. Martinez, you've stumbled into something that could destroy lives and careers. That operation was authorized at the highest levels of government, but it was never meant to leave any paper trail. Sarah's training had prepared her for many situations, but not for a decorated military officer essentially confessing to participation in illegal activities. She tried to maintain her professional composure, but her voice betrayed her growing alarm. Sir, are you saying that you knowingly participated in unauthorized military activities? Sullivan stopped pacing and fixed her with an intense stare. I'm saying that sometimes military personnel are asked to choose between following regulations and serving their country's interests. In 1986, my team was recruited for a mission that we were told was vital to national security. We were told that certain rules would need to be bent, but that we had authorization from the highest levels. He returned to his chair and leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Viktor Kozlov was not just an arms dealer, Ms. Martinez. He was an asset, our asset. The mission was to facilitate his movement of weapons to anti-communist rebels in Central America. We were told that Congress had cut off funding for such operations, but that the White House still considered them essential. Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. Operation Neptune's Gate had taken place during the height of the Iran-Contra affair, when various government agencies were conducting covert operations to fund anti-communist activities in Central America, despite congressional prohibitions. The problem was, Sullivan continued, we discovered that Kozlov was playing multiple sides. He was selling weapons to the rebels as contracted, but he was also selling intelligence about our operations to hostile governments. When we tried to report this through proper channels, we were told to continue the mission regardless. Sarah pulled out copies of Sullivan's journal entries. According to these personal notes, you documented your growing concerns about the mission's objectives and methods. Sullivan's face hardened. Those journal entries represent the thoughts of a young man who believed that documenting the truth would protect him and his team. I was naive enough to think that having evidence would give us leverage if things went wrong. Sarah placed the final document on the desk, a mission report that described civilian casualties during one of the operations. Commander, this report suggests that your team was involved in actions that resulted in civilian deaths. For the first time since the briefing began, Sullivan's military bearing completely crumbled. He put his head in his hands and remained silent for several long moments. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. We were told they were enemy combatants, he said quietly. We were given intelligence that indicated we were targeting a rebel stronghold. But when we arrived at the coordinates, we found families, civilians who had no connection to any military operation. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The decorated officer sitting across from her had just confessed to participating in what amounted to a war crime, even if it had been committed based on faulty intelligence. By the time we realized what had happened, it was too late, Sullivan continued. We reported the incident, but were told that the operation was classified at the highest levels and that any discussion of civilian casualties would be considered treason. We were ordered to consider the matter closed and never speak of it again. Sarah struggled to find words. Everything she had been trained to respect about military service and honor seemed to be crashing down around her. Commander, why are you telling me this? You could have simply claimed the documents were fabricated or taken out of context. Sullivan looked directly at her, and for the first time since the briefing began, she saw something resembling the decorated officer's normal confidence. Because, Ms. Martinez, I've lived with this secret for 37 years. I've built my entire career on the foundation of that one horrible mission, always wondering when the truth would finally surface. When I heard that case had been discovered, I knew my time was up. Sarah realized that the briefing had become something entirely different from what either of them had expected. She was no longer just analyzing historical documents. She had become the recipient of a confession that could destroy one of the military's most respected officers. "What happens now, Commander?" she asked quietly. Sullivan stood up and straightened his uniform with the practiced movements of a career military officer. "Now, Ms. Martinez, we both have to decide what's more important, following regulations or protecting the people whose lives would be destroyed by the revelation of these materials." As he moved toward the door, Sullivan paused and turned back to face her. "I want you to know that every day for the past 37 years, I've tried to atone for what happened during that operation. Every life I've saved, every mission I've completed successfully, every young sailor I've mentored, it's all been an attempt to balance the scales for what my team and I did in that jungle." After Sullivan left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at the documents spread across her desk. She now held the power to destroy the career and reputation of one of the military's most decorated officers. But she also held evidence of activities that violated everything she had been taught about military honor and service to country. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, and Sarah realized that her decision about what to do next would define not just Sullivan's future, but her own as well. Sarah spent the next 3 days in a state of moral paralysis. She had filed the required preliminary report stating that the case contained historical military documents requiring further analysis, but she had not yet submitted her final findings. Every time she sat down to write the report that would either expose Sullivan's past or bury it forever, she found herself unable to type a single word. The weight of the decision was made worse by her growing understanding of Sullivan's character. She had spent hours researching his military record, reading commendations and testimonials from subordinates who credited him with saving their lives. The man who had confessed to participating in a tragic mission 37 years ago had clearly spent the decades since then living as an exemplary officer. On Thursday evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave the office, she received an unexpected visitor. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the base's senior legal officer, knocked on her door with an expression that suggested this was not a social call. "Ms. Martinez, I need to speak with you about the materials you've been analyzing," Captain Rodriguez said as she entered the office. "I understand you've been working with some sensitive historical documents." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Someone had learned about the contents of the case, though she couldn't imagine how. She had been extremely careful to maintain security protocols and had discussed the matter only with Commander Sullivan. "Ma'am, I can confirm that I've been analyzing materials recovered from a storage facility, but I haven't completed my final report yet," Sarah said carefully. Captain Rodriguez closed the door behind her and took a seat. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. Commander Sullivan came to see me yesterday. He told me about Operation Neptune's Gate and his confession to you regarding the events of 1986. Sarah was stunned. She had assumed that Sullivan would want to keep the matter as quiet as possible, not involve additional military personnel. "He asked me to review the legal implications of those historical events," Rodriguez continued, "and to advise both of you on how to proceed. What I'm about to tell you might surprise you." Sarah leaned forward, unsure what to expect. "I've spent the past 2 days researching the legal status of Operation Neptune's Gate through official channels. What I discovered is that the operation was indeed authorized, but through a classified executive order that was never made public. The activities that Sullivan described to you, while morally questionable, were legally authorized under the emergency powers granted to the military during that period." Sarah struggled to process this information. "Are you saying that what he told me was legal?" "I'm saying that the weapons transfers and intelligence operations were authorized. However, the incident involving civilian casualties was not. That was the result of faulty intelligence provided by other agencies, not a deliberate action by Sullivan's team." Rodriguez pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it on Sarah's desk. What's more important is what I discovered about Sullivan's actions after that incident. According to classified records I was able to access, Sullivan filed multiple reports through proper channels attempting to expose the flawed intelligence that led to civilian deaths. His efforts ultimately contributed to the termination of several related operations and the prosecution of intelligence officers who had provided false information. Sarah opened the folder and found herself looking at commendations and classified reports that painted Sullivan's actions in an entirely different light. Rather than covering up the incident, he had spent months fighting to ensure accountability for what had happened. The journal entries and photographs in that case weren't just Sullivan documenting events for his own protection, Rodriguez explained. They were part of an official evidence package he compiled for military investigators. The case was supposed to have been returned to him after the investigation concluded, but it apparently got lost in the bureaucracy. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and confusion. So Commander Sullivan was trying to expose wrongdoing, not cover it up. Exactly. And there's something else you should know. The investigation Sullivan's evidence supported ultimately led to policy changes that prevent similar incidents from occurring. His willingness to come forward, despite the personal risks, likely saved other military personnel from being placed in similar situations. Rodriguez stood and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. "Miss Martinez, Sullivan specifically asked me to tell you that he understands if you feel you need to include all of these details in your official report. He said he's prepared to face whatever consequences result from the truth finally coming to light." After Rodriguez left, Sarah sat alone with the new information, trying to reconcile everything she had learned. The man she had thought was confessing to war crimes had actually been a whistleblower whose evidence had helped prevent future tragedies. The guilt and shame she had seen in his eyes weren't from covering up wrongdoing, but from carrying the weight of having been unable to prevent the original incident. The next morning, Sarah requested a meeting with Commander Sullivan. When he arrived at her office, he looked like a man preparing for execution. His posture was rigid, and his face showed the strain of 3 sleepless nights. "Commander, I've completed my analysis of the case contents," Sarah began, "and I've consulted with Captain Rodriguez about the legal implications of the historical events documented in the materials." Sullivan nodded grimly. "I understand. I'm prepared for whatever decision you've made regarding your report." Sarah opened her laptop and turned it towards Sullivan so he could read the screen. "I've written my final report, and I wanted you to see it before I submit it officially." Sullivan leaned forward and began reading. As his eyes moved down the page, his expression gradually changed from resignation to surprise, and finally to something approaching relief. Sarah had written a comprehensive report that described the case contents as historical military documents from a classified Cold War operation. She documented the materials as evidence of proper military personnel following appropriate channels to report intelligence failures and civilian casualties. Her report recommended that the documents be preserved as an example of military personnel upholding their duty to report wrongdoing despite personal risk. "Ms. Martinez," Sullivan said quietly, "this report makes me sound like a hero rather than someone who participated in a tragedy." Sarah looked directly at him. "Commander, after learning all the facts, I believe that's exactly what you were. You were a young military officer placed in an impossible situation, and when things went wrong, you did everything in your power to ensure accountability and prevent similar incidents. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of." Sullivan was quiet for several long moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "For 37 years, I've wondered if I did enough. If I should have refused to participate in that operation from the beginning. If I could have prevented those civilian deaths somehow." Sarah closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. "Commander, I can't answer those questions for you, but I can tell you that the evidence suggests you handled an impossible situation with honor and integrity. The changes that resulted from your reports likely prevented other military personnel from facing similar moral dilemmas. As Sullivan prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah one final time. Why did you choose to frame the report this way? You could have easily documented the troubling aspects of the operation and let others decide how to interpret them. Sarah smiled for the first time since the entire ordeal began. Because sometimes the most important duty of a military analyst is knowing the difference between facts and truth. The facts are that you participated in a classified operation that resulted in civilian casualties. The truth is that you spent months fighting to ensure accountability for those deaths and ultimately helped prevent similar tragedies. Sullivan extended his hand to Sarah. Thank you, Ms. Martinez. You've given me something I didn't think I would ever have again. What's that, sir? Peace of mind. After Sullivan left, Sarah submitted her final report through proper channels. The case and its contents were transferred to the Military Historical Archives, where they would be preserved as an example of military personnel upholding their duty even under the most difficult circumstances. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from Sullivan announcing his retirement after 42 years of military service. The letter included an invitation to attend a ceremony where he would be receiving a special commendation for his service as a military advisor on intelligence protocols designed to prevent civilian casualties in military operations. The commendation was based partly on his historical contributions to policy development following Operation Neptune's Gate. Sarah attended the ceremony and watched as Sullivan received recognition for courage and integrity that had taken nearly 4 decades to be properly acknowledged. As she watched Sullivan accept the commendation, Sarah reflected on how the case that had initially seemed to contain evidence of wrongdoing had ultimately revealed a story of moral courage and institutional improvement. Sometimes the most important discoveries were not about uncovering scandals, but about understanding the difference between making mistakes and learning from them. The Forbidden case had indeed shocked the SEAL commander when Sarah unlocked it, but not because it contained evidence of his guilt. It shocked him because it forced him to confront the reality that his actions, which had haunted him for decades, had actually exemplified the best traditions of military service under the most challenging circumstances. Years later, when Sarah became a senior analyst responsible for training new intelligence personnel, she would often tell the story of Sullivan and the Forbidden case. She used it as an example of how proper analysis requires understanding not just what happened, but why it happened and what lessons could be learned to prevent future problems. The case itself remained in the military archives, but its true value was not as a historical artifact. Its value was as a reminder that sometimes the most important secrets are not the ones that need to be hidden, but the ones that need to be understood in their proper context. Sarah had learned that the difference between a scandal and a learning opportunity often depends on whether someone is brave enough to seek the complete truth rather than settling for simple explanations. Sullivan lived another 15 years after his retirement, during which he frequently spoke to military academies about the importance of moral courage in difficult situations. He never spoke publicly about Operation Neptune's Gate, but his teachings about leadership and integrity were informed by the lessons he had learned from that experience. When Sarah heard about Sullivan's passing, she realized that the Forbidden case had ultimately served its intended purpose. It had preserved not just the evidence of what happened during a difficult period in military history, but the proof that even in the darkest circumstances, military personnel could choose to do the right thing. That lesson was perhaps more valuable than any secret the case had contained.